Today we're going to make a sourdough bread, and for this we take our sourdough Anton, a couple of spoons. I'm always working on the recipe. Today we take 3 spoons of sourdough and approximately 5 spoons of whole grain rye flour. Anton is a 100% whole grain rye flour sourdough. You can make sourdough with any kind of flour. How to make sourdough I'll explain in another video. Once we have fed little Anton with these approximately 5 spoons of flour, we will rest it for 6 hours so it develops a very fresh active sourdough. 4 and 5, and then we start baking with it. What we need to put in as well is a little bit of water. This comes down to kind of the feeling how much water it needs. I like to have it rather dry than wet, therefore I only use a little bit of water. And while stirring you'll find out whether it's too dry or not, so you'll add a little bit of more water. That should be enough. Just a little bit. Perfect. This is actually also how you would make the sourdough from scratch. You just take flour, water, you stir it, you let it stay for a day, you repeat the whole process for about 7 to 10 days, and then you have fresh sourdough. So 6 hours later, our little sourdough has proven quite a bit, and this is what it looks like with the beautiful bubbles. And we already have prepared 500 grams of whole wheat spelt flour, 1 teaspoon of 1 tablespoon, sorry, of salt, and 300 milliliters of water. And we're going to add now the sourdough into the water, into the flour. Beautiful. So as I said, I prefer sourdough when it's not too wet. Some people have very wet sourdough. That all depends a little bit, I guess, on the recipe one is going to use. But my experience is that when the sourdough is not so wet, I end up with better results. So here we go. And what I like to do is I first mix the flour with the sourdough before I add the water into it. But I don't think it really makes a difference, to be honest. You can use any kind of flour. You can also mix flours. So I sometimes do 100% rye breads with rye flour. Sometimes I add spelt flour, and sometimes I use regular baking flour. I like spelt the most, but that's again comes down pretty much to what one likes and not. Don't be afraid when you start kneading the dough. Sourdough will be extremely sticky, and you will have kind of something that doesn't look like a dough in the beginning, and that's totally normal. It's rye flour is the worst actually. Spelt flour is quite soft to process, but rye flour is can be quite of a headache. So I mix everything tight together, and I usually take it out, and then I start with kneading the dough. What I learned over time is not to knead the dough too hard, but rather do kind of a stretch and fold technique. because I think the result is much better. But again, this very much depends obviously on how one would like to process that. Here is the sticky thing. Again, don't be afraid, that's totally fine. What you could do is, and sometimes I do that depending on my mood, is to add a little bit of olive oil to your hands. That makes the dough not stick no more, but also it gives the dough kind of a very elastic shape. So you start mixing everything. You may find out that you're a little bit short on water. If so, no problem, just add water as you go along. Here it might be that we want to add a little water later, but first I would really like to knead everything together before we start, before we decide whether we have to use more water or not. I think rye flour compared to spelt flour, as I said, is much more difficult to process, but rye flour has way less gluten than spelt flour, which maybe is one of the reasons why it's more difficult to process. But if you're gluten intolerant, or maybe having some issues with gluten, try to get some 100% rye flour breads. Because of the low amount of gluten, you may be in the position to perfectly digest it. I had many people telling me that they can't eat bread because of gluten, and when they ate rye flour bread, they perfectly were able to digest. So why we are using sourdough is that's kind of how my grandmother used to make bread, because back then they didn't use yeast, but they just used sourdough. So kind of the sourdough replaces kind of the yeast, because it's like a bacteria culture that kicks in after a couple of days when you, as I told you, mix any kind of flour with water. For me, I think rye flour sourdough cheese works the best for cultivating a healthy and active sourdough culture. But I also had spelt sourdough cultures and whatever you like. We went to a bakery the other day, and I actually going to ask them whether I can work for them a couple of days a week, or maybe every Friday, every Saturday, as my main job I only work 80%. And they had a sourdough that's more than 100 years old, so you can see that this is kind of nice. So now starts, as I go along, as I told you, I don't like to knead it too much, starts the fold and stretch thing. So I'm gonna fold and stretch this dough for a couple of minutes more, then I put it back to that little pan or whatever it's called. I let it proof, or let it rise for a couple of, maybe for an hour or so, and then I take it out, do fold and stretch again, and I fold and stretch like 3 or 4 times, and I let it rise in there for maybe 3 hours, and after 3 hours I take it out, knead it down, stretch it down, fold it down again, and then I put it to the proving basket for another 3 hours. So I think all in all, it's fair to say that maybe 6 to 8 hours proving it seems to be a good time. So we are back after an hour. The dough has been rising for an hour untouched, and now, as I said before, I like to take it out, and I like to stretch and fold the dough a bit. I swing it. if you paid attention, I made a little mistake before because I said we were using 100% whole wheat spelt flour, and that's obviously something that doesn't exist, but we are using 100% whole grain spelt flour. So if you're used to the types, this is whole grain spelt flour type 2000. So is the rye flour that we're using for the sourdough. It's also 2000. So we stretch it. And I like to kind of let it fall a little bit because it helps to put the air inside. And then I just like to make these little rolls like that.
I would also like a treatment like that.
Yeah, you have to pay for it. So before I put it back to the bowl, what I do is, and this is mainly that the dough doesn't stick too much to the bowl.
Little massage.
I give it a little olive oil teint. So I put it back to the bowl, let it sit for another hour, take it out, repeat the whole thing, let it sit for another hour, and then I take it out, and then we're ready for the proving basket. So approximately 3 hours later, and after like 3 or 4 times kneading, stretching and folding, our dough is ready for the proving basket. What you want to do is you quickly want to knead the dough down again, and look how soft it is. Beautiful. You want to knead it down again just before you put it to the basket. And now we're gonna put the dough into the proving basket for approximately another 3 hours. And since the dough is a little sticky still, as you can see, we need to put a little bit of flour around the dough so it doesn't stick too much to the proving basket. You can get these proving baskets anywhere where you can buy bread supply. Just make sure it's made out from sustainable materials and not kind of plastic crap or whatsoever. Okay, so I'm gonna use a different kind of flour. The reason is that I'm just using a little bit of one of my less favorite flours. So this is just regular whole grain baking flour, whole grain whole wheat flour. So yeah, so that's it. So I put the dough in here. I will put the towel on top of it again, and now it will sit here for another 3 hours.
It's like you would put your baby to sleep. Very nice.
No, before it goes to the oven.
Mr. Clean.
So we're in the final process of our sourdough bread making. We just finished with the tofu. That took a little bit less than 2 hours, and you can see how soft the bread has been, was proven in the proving basket. That's exactly what you want. What we're going to do now is we're going to do the bread scoring, which is the arty party thing. And then we're going to put the bread into our little clay pot, and then we're going to put it in the oven. The oven is preheated to 250 degrees Celsius, and you want to let it sit there for 40 minutes with 250, and then another 40 minutes with 200 degrees. The first 40 minutes with the lid on top, the second 40 minutes with the lid off. That's actually from my buddy Ivan, who told me I should use these clay pots, which was a very great idea. So what I do is I water the clay pot. I put water in for maybe 30 minutes because the clay pot is soaking the water and will absorb the water later. But we're gonna put this away for now. So it just needs to be a little wet up here. And now we're going to do the artsy-fartsy thing. You have to be quick because usually the bread will lose a little bit of its shape. I use some flour just to, because of the scoring later will be much nicer. Unfortunately it's a little bit long here. Never mind. So now it's all up to your imagination how you score the bread.
With what?
With the razor sharp blade or anything like a very sharp knife, but it must be very, very, very sharp. So this time I'm going to use a different cut than usual to see how it ends up. Let's see how that goes. Yeah, it's maybe not so artsy-fartsy. You can find videos online of people doing bread scoring like crazy. So you seal it, and then you put it into the oven again. 40 minutes 250, 40 minutes 200. The first 40 minutes with the lid on top, the second 40 minutes without the lid. So what started like a day ago almost, or it feels like a day ago, we started very early in the morning, finally comes to an end. We take out the clay pot, which has no lid on anymore because we took the lid off after 40 minutes, and we let it another 40 minutes.
Oh, look at this beauty.
Then we do the little test. Sounds perfect. And look at that.
Yummy.
This is the result of 500 grams of whole grain spelt flour with a little bit of sourdough. As said, the recipe this time had 3 spoons of sourdough and 5 spoons of whole grain rye flour to feed the sourdough, and then the 500 grams of whole grain spelt flour. A little bit of salt, little cut.
So there's like an unwritten law. You should always cool down or let cool down the bread overnight. It's like everything you do, like soaking something or cooling down something, it should be always overnight. Don't ask me why, it's like unwritten law. So we let the bread cool down overnight and then we taste it tomorrow for breakfast. Oh, it smells great.
Good morning, good morning. It's one day after we made our sourdough bread, and I just cut it, and look at that. Look at these bubbles. That's exactly what you want to see. Remember that this is whole grain spelt flour, and therefore it's a little bit more compact than regular flour with the yeah, and I just tasted a small slice, and it's just amazing. Thanks for watching.